Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Starting Practice webinar with Avant Practice Solutions of Law and of Financial Services. I'd like to start by an acknowledgement of country. In the spirit of reconciliation, Avant acknowledges the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Solutions webinar series about how to manage and start your private practices. So without further ado, I'd like to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're hoping to achieve today. The team that's come together for this webinar is part of the Avant team that provides services to doctors and practice owners and practice managers in all types of practices. Together with me, we have Sav Russo, who's an associate in law, and Ben Ryan, who's a senior associate in Avant Law. Avant Law is a medical specialist law firm that works as part of Avant. And Daniel Pike from Avant Financial Services is going to be talking about financing starting your practice. So first of all, congratulations on attending the meeting today. Many doctors and potential practice owners start the journey of looking after their practice without in the way of an understanding of what they're trying to achieve. And, in many cases, it is a scary time working out how to put things together. What I want to take you through first, together with a few words from Ben, is the operational setup and considerations that you might have, and where you should lay your emphasis in terms of your research, and where you can find extra help amongst the many options out there in the community. So let's start with basics. In Avant Practice Solutions, I run a team that helps people set up and operate their practices. The reason we do that is because doctors are really good at doctoring, but may not be so good at setting up small medical businesses. And we'll take you through a few of the focuses that you should have today. Pretty simple to start thinking about your practice and thinking about practically the location. So what's your practice going to look like? How large is it going to be? How many doctors do you want to cater for? Now, in many cases, it might just be a practice for yourself. But if you're planning to build something much bigger, have other doctors and other allied health professionals joining you, then you do need to have that considered early in your plans. It's not possible to start a practice without putting together a business plan and a budget. So the reason for thinking about the location, the size and shape of your practice is going to be important as a first step, and it'll start giving you a visualization of what might come out of all of this planning. I would also recommend that you do spend time thinking about how you're going to set up your practice in terms of the fit out, because you'll spend a lot of time there and you want the amenity of the building to be nice. So it's important to have a budget around that and think about where you'd like you and your patients to be spending your time. The next step is to assess the referral network and the patient base. So who are your patients going to be? Where are they going to come from? And how are they going to know about you as a doctor or as a healthcare business? You must plan for a gradual build-up, so no one starts their practice on day one and is completely full of patients. But guess what? All doctors end up being very busy. So you can expect to grow. Just understanding the rate of growth and putting that into your business plan is an important early consideration. And we'll talk more about finances down the track, but cash is important when your access to money is important when you're starting a practice. So when thinking about the location where your patients are going to be and what the actual fit out of your practice looks like, it's important to start with the future in mind. Now, your biggest impact on your practice is going to be your ability to generate revenue from your medical activities. That is, there is no value when you can be generating $300, $400, $500 an hour working as a doctor. It's not a good idea to be working on administration, IT, or practice management. So make sure that you're investing in the right support and help to assist you taking the big step into setting up a practice. Definitely tick off these these activities in terms of the systems that you need in place. It's not that easy to set up a telephone system. It's easy once you know how, but if you've never done it before, get some good advice. Often your IT provider will help you with that, but be careful. IT providers often charge platinum coated rates for doctors, and so it's good to get a few different quotations for your telephone system or speak to an expert who's done it before. Bookkeeping and payroll is a basic administration process. It's really important as an employer that you have a proper payroll system. And if you've never done it before, I'd advise you don't do the payroll. It's a foundational part of any business, and it leaves you exposed if you're not compliant with the rules around payroll, or of course, if your bookkeeping isn't up to taxation standards. So look for outsourcing bookkeeping and payroll, and keep that hassle off your mind. But do set up with that plan in mind. Equally, as an early career doctor, if you're starting up your practice and you don't really set aside resources for transcription, you could find that you're typing your own letters. Now, for doctor, let's say the minimum fee a doctor should be charging an hour is, let's call it $240. If you're typing your letters at $240 an hour, you're probably the most expensive typist in the building. Again, focus on revenue generating activities and try and get expertise to help with transcription, like telecommunications, bookkeeping, and payroll. These components are part of every single practice. So start with a future in mind. You focus on doctoring and plan to outsource or get some help for those systems. Now, many doctors at the early stage of planning focus on trying to select the best practice management software, and that's natural because there's a choice of goods out there. The tips I would say in terms of choosing which one, think about the ones that have got the most investment behind them. There will be a rationalization of practice software in the coming 5 or 10 years in Australia. There's many small softwares that aren't going to survive. So make sure that the software you choose is future-proof. It's got good investment behind it and it's well designed. Make sure that the software you choose has got a development pathway, including integration with other applications and also investment in automation, because the largest cost inside your practice will be your staff. If you can automate what they do, it's going to reduce your costs. Getting down to the nitty-gritty of how your practice runs, I'd like everyone who's going to be starting a practice to actually map out before they take their first step how the financial handling is going to happen in a practice. By that I mean, how will you receive money from a patient? How will you receive money from insurers? How will you submit invoices to insurers? And how will you reconcile this in your bookkeeping to make sure that you've got all the money that you have charged for? The reason why I think this is really important is because I've made this mistake myself. In the first 6 months of, actually first 9 months of me practicing as a neurologist, I had over $20,000 of inpatient billing that I was not able to reconcile. I thought my practice secretary / manager was doing it for me. After she left, I found that there was about $21,000, $23,000 of unreconciled bills. To this day, I don't know whether or not I was paid that money. And the problem is, once it's been passed and you don't have the receipts or the information to check it off, simply the opportunity's gone. So that's one of the reasons I'm so adamant about this. It happens to many doctors. And when we go and look at practices and help doctors out improving their practices, it's not unusual for us to find tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars of unreconciled bills. We don't know if people are being paid or not. So setting up the systems from start is what you must do. It's simply what everyone does who runs a small business out in the community. It should be no different for doctors. And when it comes to keeping track of that, setting up business analytics and reporting, so financial reporting within your practice software, is not too hard. Getting some advice about setting that is what we do through Avant Practice Solutions, helping people set that up. So in terms of allowing you to do the doctoring, what do you need? You need a business plan. Why is that? Because patients need to be seen in the healthcare business, and a healthcare business is only viable if it's a functioning business, not losing money and making a profit. So you need a business plan for that. You are operating, if you're building a practice that other doctors are going to come to or are going to work inside, I want you to think of that not as a clinic so much as a practice management service. If you own the clinic and other doctors are coming to work in the clinic for you, you are in effect providing a practice management service. And with that in mind, you would put a business plan behind that that is more emphasizing the practice management part of it rather than you being a doctor. So some nuances about growth and how you provide the service to the other doctors and the patients in a reliable way. Um, if you want to grow the practice, a question we often get is how do you attract doctors to come and work for you? Well, everyone who's been to medical school, who's done some training, has come across other doctors. So the collegiate approach, being friendly to your colleagues and interested in the work that they do and letting them know the work you do is really the first step in building a larger practice. Now, many people on this call might have a view that they'd like to grow a large practice and get 4, 5, 6 doctors inside the practice. The first question I would ask is, would you want to work with you? And what is it that you would make you want to work with someone else? Can you fix that? Can you make it attractive for people to want to work with you? And can you help them as professionals achieve what they want, perhaps by reducing some of the hassles? When you're thinking about going into practice with other doctors, either in partnership or having them work in your practice, it's really important to work out whether or not it's possible to work together. So just because you have complementary medical skills doesn't necessarily mean that there's a complementary business opportunity. So when you're thinking about working with other people, think about it as a business proposition and test and challenge the nature of the business, the assumptions about how the business operates. And I think Ben's got some more words to say on that down the track. Ben, hand it over to you to sort of talk about how we might keep doctors incentivized to work inside a practice as they're growing up as more senior doctors.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dave. Appreciate that. Just further to David's point, really, it's that case of when you are looking to either put the business plan together for the practice or even just trying to figure out how you actually set yourself apart from other practices because there's a lot of them out there. It's important to have a bit of a think about how you're actually going to set up the service fees that your practice gets paid by each of the doctors that engage it for services. So trying to keep that line of thought of everyone knows that percentage service fees, and there's a general discussion in the industry around what service fees people are actually paying. Have a think about whether you can potentially shake that model up a little bit by offering, for example, the ratcheted service fee where the more the doctor is charging, the lower the service fee because you're making more profit off them. That incentivizes them to work a little bit harder, potentially even looking to say, well, rather than a percentage service fee, we're going to just charge you a hourly rate or a fixed rate for a day or a half day, whatever it may be, to try and make sure that you're incentivizing the doctors to not only come into the practice, but to use the practice as much as possible. If they know they're only going to pay $200 for a morning session and they get to keep 100% of whatever they bill after that fees come out, that's a pretty attractive offer for them to come in the door. Also have a bit of a think about if you are going into business with other practitioners or if you're looking to incentivize people to join, there's some interesting ways that you can actually incentivize doctors to join the practice or stay with the practice through using your company or your trust. One particular example we've seen is a share dividend policy where you effectively create a special class of shares that sit off to the side, doesn't give any doctors voting rights in the operations of the business, but what it does give them is a discretionary dividend at the end of the financial year. So if I'm one of your doctors and I'm contributing 20% of all the revenue for your practice, and you go, we really don't want to lose Ben, you might at the end of the financial year say, Ben, thank you very much for your help. We're going to give you 20% of the net profits for the practice as a thank you for your contribution. We see you potentially becoming an owner in the business one day, and we don't want to lose you. So it is that case of have a think early about how you are going to incentivize the doctors and how you're going to attract them. How do you set yourself apart from all those other medical businesses in the industry? And potentially look at some of those other ways that you can deal with them to make it a little bit more appealing. Certainly, I think Savannah is now going to take you through the joys of actually establishing your team, because it's all well and good to have the practice, but if you don't have anyone in there to support everyone, it's going to be a little bit more of a challenge.
That's right. Well, Sav might join us in a couple more slides. I think I've got the floor for a couple more, Ben. But
Okay.
uh, but you can't kick me out just yet. But look, it's a really good point. We've covered a lot of topics already in the first 4 or 5 slides here. And while we haven't given all of the answers, we've highlighted the areas where you must spend some time thinking about it. I'll point out this early in the talk, that the services and the professionals that are presenting tonight are all available for having a chat to and scoping out where they might be able to help. So with law, it's not unusual to have a chat about commercials and setting up some commercial contracts for a medical business. And in Practice Solutions, for example, we provide transcription services, bookkeeping and payroll services, and practice management consulting that are all specialized towards the people starting their practice. So the most expensive part of your practice will be your team. Let's go through a few requirements that you must cover up, or you really should think about when you're starting to establish your team. Now, I would advise against what I did, where I just simply asked around my colleagues, does anyone have someone who knows how to use best practice VIP software who might like to be my secretary? It was a step better than my mum, who started answering the telephones when I started practice, but not much better given the $23,000 of unreconciled bills that built up in the first 3 months. So what have I learned, and what do I reckon you should think about? First of all, define what you need in terms of help. Don't define it by saying you just need someone to sit in the seat who might have been a secretary in the past. So write down a position description. What do you need for your practice to operate, whether it's just for you or whether it's for the 4 or 5 or 10 other doctors that are going to work with you. Also put into that position description an idea about the organizational chart. So who is that person or those people you're going to hire? Who are they going to report to? Who's responsible for them? And by formulating in an organizational chart, you can understand who's the manager responsible for actually their professional development, their performance, and their professional feedback. And think about the rule book around which your practice operates. We call this a policies and procedures manual. Now, if it's not written down as a policy or procedure, then how will your secretary or admin support know what to do? What rules govern their activities inside the practice? Even if it's as simple as how are we going to answer the telephone, or whether or not it's okay to turn up with a tattoo on your face to sit at the front desk, or what the social media policy is. If these things aren't written down, it's difficult to enforce those rules on a administrator or a staff member after that. And through Practice, which is an Avant product, it's possible to have that full set of practice policies and procedures uploaded ready for day one of your practice to work. Now, often hiring a first medical secretary will be the first time you've ever interviewed someone. Recruitment tips that I can share is that you should look for evidence of service delivery and commitment, not evidence of having worked in your specialty or worked with your software. That sort of stuff can be trained, but nice manners and good quality service delivery is hard to train. And probably as doctors, we're not very good at training people in those things anyway, because we're off seeing patients. So look for that in a potential recruit, and try and think of the job interview or the recruitment process as selling your business. You want someone to buy into your vision of your practice. So in that sense, talk with passion about what you want to achieve, and try and find someone who aligns their wishes at work with you around that as well. Unfortunately, I can only say that seek.com.au is probably a good place to find staff, but if you apply those measures, you're probably going to get more successful employees. Most medical secretaries last for about 18 months, so don't expect to start your practice and retire with the same secretarial team. Now, I've hinted at management. Management is something that unfortunately you have to do as a business owner. You have to take responsibility for that. And so you need to manage the business, the team, and the finances. Doesn't mean you have to do all of that, all of the functions of it, but you need to have oversight. So your team has to be able to reassure you the business is working well, that the team is compliant, and you've got some governance oversight of how they're acting, and that you've got line of sight on the finances. Now, it can be very difficult to do that, or even afford a full team that's going to be able to be so experienced to report up to you. One of the easiest ways to do that is to use a fee per use service. So, for example, I've got some examples down here of how to outsource to build a team that you don't have to employ. But by contract, you can use a bookkeeper or payroll specialist. You can engage the lawyers, Avant Law, or an accounting firm to do those parts of or help you with those parts of your business. Just equally, you can engage a practice management consultant or a transcription service to do those parts of your business. The great news about using an outsourced team like this is you don't have to have them on staff, so it's pay per use, but it is a highly efficient way of getting up and running. I want to call out the practice manager fallacy. It's something that I guess I was brought up with as a trainee doctor. That most of my colleagues, my senior colleagues, would just say, hire a practice manager, make sure that they're good, and you won't have to worry about your practice. That's kind of not true these days. A practice manager's role is the toughest in the business. They've got responsibility over so much, not only finance and HR, but also governance and IT and facilities. The practice manager job description in general is so broad that there's not one single person that can adequately fulfill a role. So always look for opportunities to support who your most senior administrator is in your practice. Make sure that you set aside budget and time for training of your practice manager. Make sure that that person is backed up properly in areas they don't have the capabilities to do, for example, bookkeeping or payroll, so they can go on holidays without having to miss out paying the staff. Also reduce risk and make sure that you've got the adequate software to support them in their role, including software training. These things are really important to think about. So try not to think about your practice manager as just one magician who's going to fix everything. That person will need support in these ways. The modern practice team, I guess, has offsite backup. In Avant Practice Solutions, we provide virtual administration and reception services to specialist doctors who are starting their practice. That means you can have a full-time secretarial team supporting your practice, but you literally pay per use per the number of consulting sessions you do. And we provide Call Overflow virtual reception teams for larger practices where we're taking phone calls offsite, but working inside their practice software. And so the modern team can include offsite backup that is personalized and designed for functional operation inside your practice. At Avant Practice Solutions, we have Australian-based teams, and they're scalable and flexible. So it's a really modern way to do it. You can scan the QR code there to find out more about those services if you like, or feel free to ask some questions in the chat. And I think we're over to Sav now to talk about workplace law foundations. Sorry, I've just skipped forward.
That's all good. Thanks, David. So as Ben mentioned earlier, I'm going to take you guys through some of the fun things that you need to consider when starting a practice in relation to employment and workplace laws. So I'm just going to go back on my slide there. There we go. So first thing is Australia is one of the most heavily regulated countries when it comes to employment laws. So it's really important when you're starting a practice that you're aware of your obligations and setting yourself up to be compliant with workplace laws. Don't be too scared by it. It's all doable, but I can tell you it's a lot easier if you set yourself up properly from the beginning, get the right advice, get the right documentation and practices in place, because that's really what's going to set you up for success for complying with applicable laws. So I'm going to talk really mainly about your employees, so particularly your nursing and administrative staff. I know Ben later on is going to touch on some of the nuances around engagements between practices and doctors, so I'll leave that for him. But the first thing you need to think about when you're going to engage employees is, what sort of employees do you need and on what basis will they be employed? So do you need full-timers or part-timers? Do you need casual employees? I've also got up there fixed or maximum term employees. You need to be a bit cautious around engaging anyone on a fixed or maximum term basis as an employee. And that's where, for example, the agreement's going to end at the end of a defined period. So you're engaging them on a 1-year basis, for example. And that's because there are some new laws that came into effect in December last year, limiting the use of fixed or maximum term contracts in certain circumstances. So if you are considering using any of those, just make sure you get advice to ensure you aren't falling foul of those new laws. The next important thing to be aware of is your legal obligations. So the statutory regime, as I mentioned before, in Australia is highly regulated. The key piece of legislation is the Fair Work Act, along with the National Employment Standards, and that sets out basically the minimum terms and conditions of employment for employees in Australia. It's very important that you cannot contract out of any of these statutory entitlements, even if you pay employees more than their minimum rate of pay. And I think that's one of the kind of most common misconceptions or things that practices come to me with and say, look, but I'm paying employees more than their minimum rates of pay, so do I really need to comply with all these obligations? The answer is yes. So it's really important that you are aware of them and you get some help and support to make sure you're kind of setting yourself up to be compliant with them. So some of the key things under the National Employment Standards are the national minimum wage, but importantly, that doesn't apply if your employees are covered by an award, and I'll come to that shortly. The maximum weekly hours, which is 38 plus reasonable additional hours for full-timers. Reasonable additional hours is one of those phrases that lawyers love because it's a question of how long's a piece of string. So it keeps us in a job, unfortunately, and makes it very confusing for everyone else. Is also under the National Employment Standards, flexible work requests, casual conversion, and there's been some changes that will be coming into effect in relation to that later this year. Also minimum periods for notice of termination, redundancy pay, leave entitlements for part-timers and some for casuals as well. So I've got on the slide here some of the key leave entitlements under the NES. There's also an obligation to provide all new employees with the Fair Work Information Statement when they commence work. And this is one where I see a lot of businesses slip up on this, both in this industry and outside, and forget to provide employees with that statement. If they're a casual, they also need to be provided with the Casual Employment Information Statement. And if they're a fixed-term employee, they need to be provided with the Fixed-Term Contract Information Statement. So plenty of statements from the Fair Work Ombudsman that you need to be kind of checking off and making sure you're giving to the relevant employees. Then in relation to modern awards, which I mentioned earlier, so it's really important that you're aware of whether a modern award is going to apply to your employees. So modern awards are legislative instruments that set out the terms and conditions for certain industries and occupations. Importantly for you guys, the Health Professionals and Support Services Award is going to cover any of your admin or reception type employees, and the Nurses Award is going to cover any of your nurse employees. These awards can't be contracted out of. You don't get to decide whether the award applies. It just applies as a matter of law. And as David mentioned, this is where payroll becomes really, really important, because what the awards do is they set the minimum rates of pay and the other terms and conditions for employees in the industry. Those rates increase on the 1st of July each year. And the awards also set out other monetary benefits under the award, like penalties, overtime, allowances. Staying on top of that is really, really difficult. Interpreting the award sometimes can be really, really difficult. So getting support with doing that is absolutely fine and really important to make sure you're complying with your obligations. Importantly, again, just because you pay an employee more than their minimum rate under the award doesn't mean you don't have to comply with the rest of the obligations under the award. And again, I think that's probably the biggest myth that I hope to bust today, because I think that's probably the most common one that comes up with me and that I have to advise businesses on. Just because you're paying more doesn't mean you get to kind of put all these entitlements to one side. You still need to be complying with them. Importantly, there's also non-monetary benefits under the award. So things like breaks, consultation obligations, and rostering arrangements too. So making sure that you really sit down with the award, get a bit of an understanding of how it's going to work with your business. And when you are doing that planning and you are thinking about which employees you need, making sure you're having a look at the award and making sure your arrangements are going to be compliant with that. Then in relation to essential documentation, always, always, always have a current written contract of employment. A contract will exist whether you have it in writing or not as soon as you have someone on as an employee. If you don't have a written contract, it means that the law will imply what terms of that contract are, and generally those aren't going to be particularly beneficial for you as the employer. So having a written contract is going to be really, really important. In terms of essential workplace policies, there are lots that you can have, and David mentioned a couple earlier, but two of the ones that we really, really recommend are an appropriate workplace behavior policy, or a policy essentially that deals with discrimination, sexual harassment, bullying, victimization, and also a related complaints procedure. And the reason we recommend that, is because it's really important from a compliance perspective and limiting the business's exposure for vicarious liability for this type of conduct. It's a very, very high risk area. In particular, there's been several new laws around a positive duty in relation to sex-based discrimination in particular. So having a policy is essentially the bare minimum to ensure you're compliant with that positive duty and really protecting the practice in relation to if any of these issues do arise within the practice. If you're based in either the New South Wales, or the ACT, you'll also need to have a workplace surveillance policy that's compliant with applicable laws in order to conduct workplace surveillance. And workplace surveillance isn't just, James Bond style surveillance cameras set up anywhere or everything like that. Workplace surveillance is literally just if you have access to, the employee's computer system and can see what they're doing, can look at the inboxes, that kind of thing. So any sort of surveillance over what employees are doing at work on your systems counts as workplace surveillance. We generally recommend avoiding having really, really prescriptive policies on dealing with performance management, discipline, and termination. You can absolutely have kind of general policies that give a bit of broad overview of how you might manage those sorts of situations. But generally, you want to have as much flexibility as possible when managing your employees in those sorts of contexts, because you as a business need to be able to kind of approach things depending on the specific circumstances. And then the final thing I just wanted to touch on really, really briefly is one key risk area that I see in this business is sham contracting. And so sham contracting is effectively where you engage a person who's an employee as an independent contractor at law. So that's unlawful, and significant penalties can apply if you do engage in sham contracting. And there's also been recent law reforms in this area, and they're coming into effect later this year. So there's going to be increased scrutiny around this. And I think the key takeaway really around this is just because you call someone an independent contractor doesn't mean they really are at law. So if you're thinking of engaging anyone as an independent contractor in your business, make sure you get advice so that you can determine, look, is this person really a genuine independent contractor at law, or are they actually an employee, and do I need to set them up properly as employees so that I can really protect my business and kind of reduce risk on that front. And that's all from me. Thanks, David. I think over to Ben now.
Perfect. Thanks, Sav. And look, great warm up to the fun half of the presentation, which is all of the finances and what do you guys actually have to do practically to implement all of this and roll it out, other than obviously signing up with APS. But really, when you get to starting a private practice, you may have picked up on getting it right the first time is much easier than having us come in and try and fix things up retrospectively. It's very difficult. So certainly our advice is always talk early and talk often with your lawyers and your advisors, because usually it will save you a lot of money in the long run. When you are thinking about starting a private practice, or if you're listening tonight with the view of, making sure you've potentially done everything correct from the start, have that thought of, are you a sole practitioner who's only ever going to be working by yourself? Are you an orthopedic surgeon who's going to have your own room and just be working from the hospital? Or are you potentially a anaesthetist or an obs-gyn that needs the benefit of having other people that you can share the roster with and the load with? If you are looking to work potentially in a general practice as well, it's a lot easier to incentivize people to come join your practice if you have a company that you can say to them, hey, come buy into this group with me. We can share the costs, but we'll also share the profits. As a sole trader, it's very difficult to have people come in and buy into your business. So you might establish the greatest business in the world, but then you're going to have to transition it across to a company or a trust. So have that thought, have that discussion. We always recommend sitting down with your accountants and your lawyers at the outset, just so that everyone's on the same page of what's the best thing for you. Trusts are one of those other options. Usually we see a trust sitting in with the company. Get the most of all those tax advantages. Particularly, that's the benefit of sitting down with your accountants at the start. They'll be able to make sure you get everything right off the front foot. We don't see too much of partnerships these days due to the increase in risks for the partnership. So these are the three most likely structures for you. In terms of then, you're going to come up with a brand name, hopefully. Ben Ryan Specialist Doctors doesn't sound very good. I personally wouldn't buy into that. But have a bit of a think about what your practice name is. If you're going to be very descriptive of Brisbane Orthopaedic Surgeons or Brisbane General Practice, that's going to be fairly difficult for people to take and to grow and have different locations. Some of the big corporates you see have brand names that are recognizable and not tied to the specialty or the location. So have a bit of a think about what your business is going to be called and whether you have plans for multiple locations. Fun fact, you can't actually register copyright. So if you've paid to register the little copyright logo for your business, you've probably lost $50 to some scammers. Trademarking is something that you can register, however. So make sure that you don't use that little logo until you have a registered trademark. You can use little TM next to your logo if you've applied for a trademark, but otherwise, please don't use those symbols. In terms of having to think about what your practice is going to be as well, at the outset, before you go and launch everything, make sure that you have a look at some websites, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, all of those things, and make sure that there's no other competitors that are using those brand names. Happens very often where your designers and your marketing people will come up with all the best things in the world, but sometimes they don't check IP Australia's website, for example, and there's some existing brands that are already trading that way, so it can be a sunk cost straight at the outset. Privacy is a big burning issue in the corner that not many people are talking about. We've seen significant privacy reform starting to make its way through Parliament. So have a think about the fact that health is already an incredibly regulated industry from a privacy perspective. If you're not making sure you comply with all of your obligations, it can be very expensive. That means not only privacy consent forms when patients are coming to the practice, but also your website terms and conditions. Usually that's the first port of call people have with your practice. And as Sav said, making sure that your policies and procedures are up to date with APS or whoever it may be, so that your privacy policies for your staff are up to date and everyone knows what to do if there is a data breach or a privacy issue. In terms of service agreements, it's the most talked about thing at the moment with the joys of payroll tax. Payroll tax, of course, can apply to any practice. It's not just GPs, it can apply to specialists. But keep in mind, particularly with the benefit of starting your own practice, you have the opportunity to get everything right on the very start. So please make sure that you're considering all of the information that's out there. This is a very brief snapshot of it, but really it's that case of when you break down a service agreement, what you're thinking about is a practice is either a group of doctors or your practice as an individual doctor. You're paying for all of the services, the staff, the support, the equipment, the programming as well. And you're providing that for other people so that they don't have to go off and pay for it themselves. So you're sharing the cost of those things, you're providing those services. Make sure that your agreement is very clear that you're providing the services and potentially some facilities, and that it's not you engaging the doctors to provide services. If there's nothing wrong with you engaging the doctors to provide services for you, but as Sav said, that's an independent contractor agreement or potentially an employment agreement, and you just need to make sure you're contracting with them properly. In terms of property, Dan's obviously going to be pushing for you guys to buy it because that's the best thing that you can do. If you can own the practice that you're going to be trading from, you have a guaranteed tenant because you're your own tenant and you're your own landlord. The benefit of that is you're going to always pay your rent, but also you guys hopefully will be wanting to build up your practices as a business that you can potentially sell to the next generation or people within. If you own the building or the premises that you're trading from, you can sell the practice and have some passive income coming through by way of rent, which is a fantastic way of funding that retirement, as well as keeping some money coming through. So make sure you have a bit of a think about whether you are in a position to potentially buy the practice. As I say, Dan, I'm sure we'll be talking about that very shortly. If you aren't in a position to do so, there can be some fantastic advantages that you can negotiate with your leasing. It's a lessee market to an extent at the moment, so making sure you ask for incentives by way of either rent abatements or contributions by the landlord towards your fit out are really convenient ways of trying to reduce those costs for the practice at the outset, particularly when you are trying to get yourself off the ground. At the end of the day, if you're not thinking about what your plans are when you come to retire from the very outset, you are on the back foot already. We all like to daydream about when we finally get to kick back and relax. Unfortunately, it's a long way away for some of us, but for those of you that are just looking to start a practice, it should be one of your main prerogatives. So if you can look to find, as I say, a practice that you can own the premises for, you've got that guaranteed rental, you're not having to negotiate with third-party landlords, that's a massive win. Have a think about how you're going to incentivize people to come into the practice. As I said earlier, you want to be thinking about potentially how you can offer share incentives or other aspects to keep people in the practice and to help you grow it. Estate planning is one of those things that people don't necessarily like to talk about or think about. But when you are building your wealth, you need to make sure that you have everything protected. That's not just having necessarily your wills and enduring powers of attorney sorted out, but also making sure that you think about how all of your assets are held. Unfortunately, in health, there's not too much of a veil that you can achieve personally and professionally, in the sense of if you're going to have any issues with patients, they'll usually sue you in your individual capacity as well. But hey, that's why you have insurance. But hey, have a think about as well, if you are going to have investment properties potentially or other assets, whether you can hold those in other structures like companies and trusts to try and keep those assets protected from potential claims, but also to protect your family and make sure that they're provided for in the future. Particularly when you think about, certainly no one likes talking about it, but after you pass away, if you just own that property in your own name, it's going to be dealt with by your will. It might go to your partner, but if you have it held in your superannuation fund potentially or in a family trust, there's separate pieces of legislation that help govern that to make sure that it goes where it needs to go or where it should go. My favorite estate planning aspect that a lot of people don't necessarily think about, but is a really great way of actually building wealth and making sure that your family is looked after you pass off, is thinking about having a testamentary trust. As a very general principle, appreciating that we don't have an hour to talk about testamentary trusts. Within your wills, you can provide for a testamentary trust, which is effectively any normal sort of trust, so your discretionary trust or your family trust that people are familiar with, but it's held by your estate. And so you can hold assets within there potentially and make sure that your children are getting not only tax advantages by rent that's potentially coming through, but you can have provisions there to make sure that distributions to children under 18 are going where they need to go and how they need to go. You can potentially make greater distributions or sell off assets and make sure that it's as tax effective as possible. So a really great way of continuing to look after your family even after you do pass away, which is fantastic. I think that's the speed round of all of the legal considerations that you need to think about generally with private practice. And now Dan's going to talk to you guys about the finance options.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, Daniel Pike here. So I'm part of Avant Financial Services. We're actually one of the newer arms of the broader Avant group. A very exciting time for us as we've just actually launched our own lending solutions. So not only are we lending through the broader market, we're actually providing our own lending solutions as well. So just going to touch on a few key considerations around financing your practice and sort of what your options might be. So first of all, talking about the commercial property. So Ben touched on this not too long ago around buying versus renting. Generally speaking, when a practice first starts, they would begin as a tenant rather than buying. Now, the problem you've got when you're renting instead of buying is you're going to spend a lot of money fitting out that practice. And if you're only there for 2, 3, 4 years as a result of the lease terms, potentially you're actually losing a fair amount of money that you've spent in that fit out. Now, looking at buying from the offset, obviously it's a large commitment and a bit of a cash outlay, but you actually own that space. You can make improvements, and the fit out itself is attached to that property. Really important to consider zoning. So when you're looking at choosing a property where you would like to establish your business, making sure that is zoned appropriately. So be it a commercial zoning, or it may be a residential zoning where medical is actually allowed within that particular council. The last thing you want to do is purchase a property and then find out you can't start your medical practice there. So very important to look at your zoning. Location's been touched on earlier as well. It's really important. You want to make sure that your patients have access to that property, be it parking or public transport. But also just considering who else is operating in that area. Do you have those referrals in that area? Potentially, is there competition in that area? Starting a brand new practice in an area that's already saturated may hurt your sort of success in running that practice. And also, is the property the right size? 150 square meters might suit you today, but in a few years' time, when the practice is grown, you don't want to be looking for a brand new practice location as a result of that growth. So factor these things early. And that also factors into the property layout and the floor plan. So talking earlier about the functionality of the space and having good patient flow, but also, can it be fit out appropriately? Does it meet your needs as a practitioner? And that's why if you're looking at buying first, you need to look at these things, obviously with more scrutiny, to make sure it is an appropriate long-term solution. Whereas renting, you do have that flexibility. If it isn't quite 100% right at the end of your term, you can move. And just one more thing around renting. If you can't buy now, potentially it's worth discussing in the lease arrangement an option to buy at the end of your term. So if sorry, slides aren't moving. If buying is what you ultimately decide to do, great news. You can actually fund up to 100% of that through finance. So no out-of-pocket costs, excluding your regular stamp duty and other fees. 30-year loan term, so in line with residential mortgage. And there are options to borrow in both your SMSF, which we did a webinar about a couple of days ago, which is online, but also you can buy in companies, trusts, all other structures. So it is very flexible, and it really suits you as a doctor. And to be honest, in the broader market, 100% finance isn't offered to just anybody. Being a doctor really has a benefit in this market, getting that practice early. Next thing to discuss is the actual fit out and the equipment. Now, we just mentioned around fit out, they can be quite costly. It's worth factoring into your fit out plans, your growth plan as well. So if you only need 3 consult rooms now, potentially it's worthwhile having additional space toward the back of the practice that can be used for storage or other things in the short term, but has a long-term plan to actually be used as a consult space. If you're a dentist, for example, you might only need 1 chair today, but in 3 years' time, you might need 2 or 3. So have those provisions in place so that when you do want to grow, it can be done easily. The electrical fit out has been done, the plumbing has been done, and that practice is actually far more functional long term. Now, on electrical and plumbing, definitely speaking to medical expert fit out companies has massive advantages. I've seen many cases where people have used general builders and they missed the nuances within medical, widened doorways, for example, disabled access, plumbing into each room for hand basins, all these small things that can be missed and can be very costly to fix in the long term. And also just factoring in your equipment as well. So thinking about what you actually will need to run a functional practice. Looking at the actual finance options around fitting out that practice. So we'll be looking at what's called a practice drawdown facility, essentially an approved limit, which you draw down periodically throughout the fit out time. And the great thing about this facility is there are no payments made during the fit out. So whilst the builders are there, you're not receiving any revenue from your practice, you're not making any repayments. Once the fit out is actually complete, we would then convert that into a normal amortizing loan. So that would be over a maximum loan term of 7 years. Gives you great cash flow advantage of not having those outlays until the practice is actually open. And again, 100% on the fit out, 100% on the equipment. So really good options there for actually fitting out the practice and looking at the practice equipment. And just moving on to the next part, which is actually purchasing an existing practice. So we're talking about starting your own practice, but potentially you're not starting from scratch. You've identified another practice in the market which is selling, and you think that would be a perfect fit for yourself. Now, probably the hardest thing about that is ascertaining fair value. So what is that practice worth? Now, unfortunately, you can't just jump on Domain like you would with a house and figure out what the next door neighbor's house sold for. That information isn't publicly available. So we need to go through a process of actually looking at the financials, vetting those financials, and applying a value. So we use what's called a multiple of EBITDA, and also a percentage of gross revenue. So look at 2 different metrics to figure out that value. And there are different sort of indexes we apply for different specialties. So it does differ, but that's how you would get the value there. And then speaking to your accountant, really important around getting them to look at the financials, vet them. They're trained to pick up small things that you and I would miss within the financials. And also looking over as a minimum 2 years, ideally 3 years, just because COVID had an impact on a lot of practices, which may sort of skew the results. And also just understanding what you're buying. And Ben spoke about it before around trust, companies, sole traders. So when you're buying this practice, are you buying the units in a trust? Are you buying the shares in a company? When you're buying into a sole traders practice, what are you actually getting? You can't buy their ABN. So are you getting rights to their patient list, their IP? How's it all look? And that's where services such as what Ben was saying, speaking to Avant Law and understanding what your rights are, but also from a lending point of view, understanding what you're purchasing, because ultimately the lender needs to know. And yeah, you need to know as well as the practitioner. So when we're talking about buying in, we're talking about a goodwill loan. So you're buying against the goodwill in the business. And yeah, again, 100% finance for goodwill, 15-year loan terms and flexible security options. So we're talking flexible there where we're not looking to take security over your home. Again, Ben mentioned not sort of crossing your assets, your personal assets with your business assets. Same situation. In an ideal world, you don't want to be putting your home up as collateral for a business loan. And when we're looking at our goodwill loans, generally speaking, we wouldn't be factoring in taking a security over your home. So another important consideration there. So just in summary, you'll see 100% nearly everywhere on all my slides. And that, as I said, as a doctor, you're quite lucky in the sense that most often you don't actually need to use personal savings or put in a deposit when you're starting a practice. So yes, there will be costs involved, but it doesn't necessarily mean paying a hefty deposit. So when you are tossing up between buying versus renting, buying sort of bottom of the range equipment versus top of the range, it's an option there to just have a look at all these different lending options that do cover 100%. And just lastly, I would say the main things to consider: planning ahead, speak with your accountant, speak with a medical finance expert, and speak with a lawyer. Work with a team to actually help you through this whole process because you can't do it by yourself. I think that's the end of my time, and I believe we're going on to questions. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Dan. It's fabulous to have Avance back as doctors, knowing they provide financial services and the expertise that you need to be able to confidently look at funding. Look, we've got a question that I think we've got time for, and please, if there are any other questions, please put them into the Q&A chat. We have got time for one or two. Simi's asked Ben how to join as a partner in an existing business. Ben, perhaps run us through the 30-second highlights of what he should be thinking about.
Yeah, look, partnerships are always difficult because when you think about a partnership, effectively, as soon as a person comes in or goes out, that's effectively a new partnership that's being created. So it's a whole new business. There can be tax implications for transferring the assets of the partnership to the new partnership. Or at the very least, if you're going to be a 50% owner and you're buying half the business off of one person that's currently owning it themselves and creating a partnership, then there's still going to be that 50% acquisition of part of a business. So there can be some stamp duty implications and some other things. So important to sit down with your accountant early and sit down with your lawyers as well, and just make sure that you're talking about what that process looks like early days so that you can do the most tax advantageous route possible and tick off all of the necessary agreements that you need to as well.
Ben, there's been another question, and it might be worth just touching on that in the same vein. When we're talking about profit sharing, you spoke briefly about providing some incentives and different types of shares to people. Have you got some sort of tips on how and when you'd set up this model for profit sharing and what different considerations there are?
Yeah, look, I think we were talking about this on the weekend actually, David, weren't we? In terms of when you are looking at going into business with other people, it's important to have that consideration of how are we going to actually split the profits of the practice? Is it going to be a case of, if, David, if you and I went into practice together, which would be a good trick because I'm not a neurologist, but let's say for argument's sake I was, and I was working, 5 days a week full time and you were working 1 day or 2 days or whatever it's going to be. Are we going to have an income split where I potentially receive a greater percentage of the income because I'm working more? Or are we just going to split it 50-50 or however the shares are held in the business? Appreciating as well that if you've got existing owners in a business that they've already built up that equity and they've built up the business that you have the benefit of buying into. So I wouldn't say it's a reasonable expectation if you're looking to join a practice that you're going to suddenly have equality in terms of the distributions of the group. It will depend on the shareholder agreement. If you're looking to join a practice as a shareholder and there isn't a shareholder agreement, I would make that phone call to me very quickly and we would get to a shareholder agreement very quickly before you join that practice, because I like to use the anecdote of a shareholder agreement as an insurance policy. Hopefully, you never have to refer to it because everything runs very smoothly in the practice. But if you ever do have any issues with the other owners or with the profit sharing or anything like that, you're very glad to have a written shareholder agreement that you can pull out of the bottom drawer. It will save you a lot of money on a shareholder dispute, that's for sure.
Yeah, I think the overarching message there is that you definitely should take formal advice when it comes to joining a practice or joining a partnership. So much can go wrong. For everyone who's presented tonight, we've all seen it go wrong, and it's distressing as a person, as a professional, and amongst colleagues as well. And so much of it can be resolved by planning beforehand and getting formal advice so that you know the pathway forward. We have run out of time for questions. There have been a few more, and we'll certainly look to bring them up at further meetings. What I can say is that Avant Financial Services, Avant Law, and Avant Solutions are available for scoping discussions to discuss the extent of our services and how they help you plan and open up your practice. A specialized experience is at hand now that Avant has diversified into these areas. And we're really pleased that you took the time to learn more about our services, and look forward to you joining on some other webinars that we're going to be publishing soon too. So have a good night, everyone. Thanks for coming.